Overtime, guys. Unexpectedly, we are back for the Thousand Worlds Book Club, and we are talking about With Morning Comes Mistfall. For a while now, mainly because a lot of people really love this story, people have been requesting that I do With Morning Comes Mistfall, but it didn't seem to have any relationship to the Thousand Worlds universe. There were no Earth Imperials, or even a mention of Old Earth, no Jangles, no Harangans or Findi, no Ecological Engineering Corps, no Erica Stormjones. Finally, someone pointed out to me that the story mentions a world called New Refuge, and the Stone City also mentions New Refuge. And so there it is, With Morning Comes Mistfall is in fact in the Thousand Worlds universe. And this means With Morning Comes Mistfall is likely our earliest story in the timeline, even earlier than Warship. Humanity in our story is just beginning the colonization of the galaxy, and so this is long before the Double War. With Morning Comes Mistfall is actually a fairly short and simple tale where very little happens, but it does get right at one of our author's largest conflicts with both his writing style and how he sees the universe. It's the conflict of science and magic, facts and legends, logic and feeling, the physical versus the spiritual, and sci-fi versus fantasy. So With Morning Comes Mistfall takes place on the planet of Wraithworld, a planet covered by a beautiful mist that shifts throughout the day. The setting is somewhat similar to the Eyrie, and Mistwood in the Stormlands is named for this story. In fact, our author accidentally calls Mistwood Mistfall in the second Ariana sample chapter. There are some unexplored mysterious ruins on the planet, but most work is unable to be performed on the planet because of the mist and because people think the planet is haunted by wraiths. There is a pervasive legend of wraiths who have supposedly killed various people throughout the years, namely an expedition led by a man named Gregor. The legend has brought a share of tourists hoping to spot a wraith, and the world has a somewhat popular hotel on a mountaintop owned by a man named Sanders. It seems our author took the names of the Clegane brothers, Sander and Gregor, from this story. So the story stars an unnamed protagonist who is a journalist. Our author studied journalism in college and taught it for a number of years, and this journalist has been tasked with covering a new scientific expedition led by a man named Dubovsky. Dubovsky wants to finally get down to the bottom of whether or not wraiths are real. He has planned a very detailed mapping and exploration of the planet in order to do this. The expedition has upset the hotel owner Sanders, who feels Dubovsky just doesn't understand things, not just the appeal of the planet, but life in general. Our protagonist plays a sort of neutral party. He's not a scientist and is not really part of the Dubovsky expedition, but he also has no stake in Sanders' hotel either. He appreciates beauty and has some general skepticism to the idea of wraiths, but is open to the idea that they actually exist. Our journalist starts chatting with Sanders while watching mist rise and mistfall every day, and a friendship of sorts begins. The protagonist initially thinks that Dubovsky's expedition is an understandable quest for knowledge, and that Sanders is simply worried about his business. The mystery of wraiths has brought tourists to the planet to see if they can spot one, and without the mystery, they may not come. Sanders is insulted by the accusation that all he cares about is money, and stops speaking to the protagonist for a while. While following Dubovsky on his expedition, the protagonist begins to better appreciate the nature of the planet. He goes on walks and accompanies hunters, and he finds weird forests and odd animals. He begins to find the world hauntingly beautiful. Eventually, Sanders warms to the protagonist again, perhaps noticing the protagonist's growing love for the planet. But then one day, Dubovsky accidentally calls Mistrise Mistfall, and Sanders simply flips out, furious that Dubovsky doesn't know the difference between the two after months of being there. After that, our journalist and Sanders become very good friends, and Sanders then shows him a bunch of hidden secrets of the planet. Sanders takes him to see mist waterfalls and island swamps and other crazy sights all around the planet. Eventually, the protagonist runs out of things to write about with regard to the Dubovsky expedition, and starts writing mainly about his time with Sanders and the nature. Later, Dubovsky finishes his work and is overwhelmingly successful. He proves there are no wraiths, and even debunks a sighting by the original Gregor expedition by determining that original sighting to be a bunch of baboons. Sanders is livid as the planet has now lost its charm, though Dubovsky thinks now the planet will benefit. Now it can be farmed and exploited without fear. In the end, though, the tourists stop coming to Wraithworld, and Sanders' hotel goes out of business. It becomes a ruin, like the other ruins on the planet. Farming is mostly unsuccessful, except for a strange wine that is produced that our protagonist loves. So it's rather clear that our story is actually a debate going on within the mind of our author. The characters represent positions of an argument. And we've seen this structure before. A Song for Aaliyah is a story where the protagonist is caught between the human desire for togetherness and the human desire for individuality, each represented by a character. Or we can look at In the House of the Worm, where different characters represent philosophical schools. Here, Dubovsky represents knowledge and science, while Sanders represents mystery and mysticism. Now, it's worth mentioning that George R.R. Martin was a sci-fi guy, so the people he was hanging around with and admired were science-oriented people who would default to the merits of progress. But Martin is also a lover of poetry and believes that on a different level, there is a beauty and intrigue to mystery. And this does get into George R.R. Martin's writing style. Over 27 stories spanning 15 years, we don't really know anything about the Findi or the Harangans. We didn't really get all of the answers surrounding the Vulcan and Night Flyers. Did Del Vecchio die in Men of Greywater Station? Did Annalyn bring peace in the House of the Worm? What was up with that eight-legged cat in This Tower of Ashes? What's in store for Chloronymus in The Glass Flower? Did Star Lady and Golden Boy survive? What about Dirk at the end of Dying of the Light? Who knows? George R. Martin didn't want us to know the answers. Rather than everyone dying or happily ever after, most of the stories that we've read have left a fog of mystery. Now with this discussion, I can't help but also think about the differences between sci-fi and fantasy. George R. Martin is rather focused on what he calls furniture rules. That is, fundamentally, there is no difference between sci-fi and fantasy, they are just dressed up differently, like a room with different furniture. Our author even dedicated A Storm of Swords to Phyllis Eisenstein, who convinced him to make his book more fantasy-oriented, with the dragons put back in. And often in Ice and Fire, we are left with mysterious magical happenings that could possibly be explained logically with science. Was Aeron really raising the dead on the beach, or was that mouth-to-mouth resuscitation? Do the pyromancers really have spells to manage the wildfire, or are they just clever mechanisms like Tyrion thinks? Was Courtney Penrose killed by his own men, or a shadow baby? Was Storm's End really built with magic, or long-lost advanced engineering? Was Daenerys really wandering a magical labyrinth in Karth, or did she simply take a psychotropic drug? For each of these questions, you may fall on the science side or the magic side, but our author is clearly presenting the opposition of science and magic to make us wonder. The unknown makes the story more interesting. Now I should note that the fundamental mystery in With Morning Comes Mistfall is the largest mystery in life, and perhaps the largest mystery of science. The wraiths over and over in our story are called ghosts. They are disembodied consciousness, a subject our author loves to write about. Consciousness is the song in A Song for Leah. This makes Dubovsky's expedition for the wraiths a metaphorical search for whether or not there's a human soul. And this gets into whether or not scientific progress is truly always good. Is it a good thing to answer the ultimate question? Is it a good thing to prove that we are soulless? To prove once and for all that consciousness and self-discovery and the human heart and conflict are all meaningless? How would that affect art and literature? How would that affect the human mind? I'm sure everyone has their own opinion on this one. But yes, the point of the story is that when Sanders and our protagonist are looking out on Wraithworld, they are really looking out on the beauty and mystery of the human soul and enjoying all of the wonders that comes from that experience. The question of wraiths and the question of souls and being is a frightening one, but ultimately, in our author's opinion, a rewarding one. And this is all regardless of whether or not souls actually exist. What our author is saying is that the search for one's soul and that self-discovery is of value in itself. And our author fears that there are people like Dubovsky who do no self-examination. Remember, a lack of self-examination was our author's big problem with Valkyrengi in A Song for Leah. And it seems our author is wondering that without a mystery of the soul, would anyone bother with self-examination? And our author questions what the utilitarian value would be for such a discovery. Dubovsky thinks that a wraithless wraith world will be profitable and useful, but in the end, it isn't really. Of what value is there to discovering that we're soulless? Dubovsky would argue that we're crippled by superstition. Once liberated, we're free to do other things. But our author would argue that there's value to the unknown, there's value to the mystery. It makes people search, and that search is of value. And once again, we say goodbye to the Thousand Worlds Book Club. That is, unless someone finds yet another story. This is the third discovery since the club began. And yes, I do know about the lonely song of Lauren Dor that mentions Bacalon. I'm not sure what to think about Lauren Dor. It's kind of a fantasy story involving dimension hopping and doesn't really fit with the rest of the Thousand Worlds universe. And Bacalon is in Ice and Fire as well, so it might just be some sort of callback. Anyway, as I said last time, I do eventually plan on doing a retrospective for all of these stories. So that'll be sometime in the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then.